Okay, so this is the follow-up video. So video number 2 for today. This video is for people who, one, either cannot view the America, the Story of Us kind of movie for whatever reason, or two, really just want to know a little bit more about the Revolutionary War, even though we're going to go over some more tomorrow. So if you can view the video, you do not need to watch this. And if you are doing your own work, that is fine too. So we'll put this up here. So we are going to be jumping into the American Revolution. So we looked over the Declaration of Independence. We saw the reasons, right? The colonies were leaving Britain, and we read the beliefs they had and, hopefully the country they wanted to set up. Britain, of course, didn't like this, and was very much so willing to fight and do whatever it took to make themselves ready, right, to get the colonies back. So with the Declaration of Independence, the American Revolutionary War is officially started. So some strengths of the colonies. So they did have a strong leader in George Washington. George Washington was a pretty well-seasoned general. He kind of was de facto head of the revolutionary forces. So he was a very strong leader. A lot of people believed in him, even though he definitely struggled a bit at the beginning. They were familiar with the land. They knew, the rivers, the forests, the trees. They had all of this knowledge of the land, and they knew the people in the land and were able to kind of factor that into their plans. And they could use guerrilla warfare tactics. So a new invention, moving around, is made during this time, or saying not a new invention, a change is made to an already existing invention at the time that made it possible for Americans to really use a more long-distance tactic and kind of a hit-and-run style warfare. This had not been really used before. Americans had a gun that specialty had kind of rotations down it. And so when the bullet would come out of the gun, let's see if we can do this, it would actually be rotating. This made it shoot straight. Whereas before, if it was like this, the bullets would kind of float around a little bit. When it's spinning, it keeps it more stable. So Americans had guns that were more accurate. In particular, American riflemen, so back in the country, and the frontiersmen had these special guns that allowed them to fight from a distance. No longer did you have to be close to shoot someone. You could actually use sniper tactics and shoot at a distance where people wouldn't be able to see you. In particular, we also would shoot and go to war and fight and then run and gather and then fight again. And we're much faster than the British in this. We also kind of broke some international war agreements in that we didn't necessarily shoot the foot soldiers, but instead went for the leaders. So that was kind of a important tactic that hadn't really been used before and was considered kind of a bad. So other strengths of the colonies, we end up having a French alliance, which means we have a military agreement with France. They're going to help us. Some strengths of the British. One, this is a weakness, but look at their red coats. I know maybe some of y'all go hunting. Does this look like camouflage? Not so great. So they stood out very significantly in any sort of terrain. Very easy to spot. But the strength that they had really well-trained soldiers. So the British soldiers were and possibly had been very well traveled. They had gone from different countries. They had already invaded and controlled almost every continent in the world. Not fully controlled it, but they had invaded, I think, every continent. Let's think. What else? Or they lived there. America, minus maybe South America. So these soldiers had a lot of experience. They also had a huge, huge navy, which means ships. So their ships were not only big, but also well crafted, in part because they used lumber and shipbuilders from the colonies. So the colonies had cut down a bunch of trees, built the ships, and then sent them to the British. And then those ships were turned back around and used against the colonies when we declared independence. And in general, even though the British were broke, and that's why they were doing taxes, they still had a lot of money and supplies in comparison to the colonies. So they had food, they had more guns, they had more ammunitions. So they had a lot more supply and money. Some weakness of the colonies. They were broke. There weren't a whole bunch of people to serve in the army, and that's why we used these kind of backhanded tactics of guerrilla warfare. We had a very small and weak navy. We did have a few ships, but not a lot. British weaknesses, because they also had weaknesses. They were not as familiar with the land. They didn't know the land, in particular in the areas of forest. They were not familiar with kind of this wilderness style of warfare. They're much more used to open field style of fighting. So what they would do was actually kind of march in a line, forward, 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 and then shoot in a straight line, which obviously makes them very easy targets for people hiding in the woods to shoot. Lexington and Concord, you guys should have done that last section, but we'll review it, right? So when the British hear that the colonists are hiding ammunitions in Concord, they start to march that way. So outside of Lexington, they meet the Minutemen. So they meet some colonists who are hoping to stop them. There's a brief, very brief skirmish, but in this case, the British win, and the colonists retreat. However, once they get to Concord, the colonists who had retreated and made ready and let people know that the British were coming, and the British actually have to retreat all the way back to, essentially, Boston. They were not prepared. They were outgunned, which set the tone and gave colonists hope that they could win. Battle of Bunker Hill. The British did win this battle, but it was very costly. So this was probably the deadliest battle of the Revolutionary War. More than 1,000 British soldiers and about 400 American patriots were killed or wounded. This was the beginning of the understanding this was going to be a long war. That the British thought that maybe the colonies would surrender after this point, and then they didn't, and they wouldn't. In the hope of a surprise attack, Washington tries to attack on Christmas night. So they cross the Delaware and they have the Battle of Trenton. So this worked out really well for Washington. They had not been prepared to fight on Christmas Day because it's Christmas Day. But this victory was definitely a turning moment in the understanding that we possibly could win this war. There was not so sure, and then this happened, and then so did this one. So Battle of Saratoga. Saratoga is in New York. The first one, not so great. The second was a decisive victory for the Americans. This, in particular, was huge. The reason the Battle of Saratoga was so successful is because as the British troops had been going through the forest to get to Saratoga, their leaders and guides had been slowly picked off by rebel snipers and guerrilla warfare tactics. So the rebels had already put together a group to slowly eat away at the British forces. So by the time they got to Saratoga, they were demoralized, and the larger contingent of colonial soldiers could win. This victory inspired France to join the war on the side of the colonies. So Benjamin Franklin was in charge of trying to convince, France to join. France and Britain had been enemies for a long time, and so France was like, yeah, why not? We'll just go to war again. No biggie. The problem became, even with French support, Washington finds himself stuck. He has a army of about, I think it was 14,000 at this point, of 14,000 people, and they are camping out in Pennsylvania. Winter hits, and it is brutal. It is super cold. Not only is it cold, they don't have a lot of supplies, no rations, no clothes, and they also have smallpox, and there's a sickness going through. So over 2,000 men died during this winter. The surviving soldiers emerge not only kind of battle-hardened, feeling like they made it through, but also with inspiration. Why? Because they had gained training. So Washington had actually recruited a military general, never remember his name, from Prussia, to essentially come in and train the military. This all comes together for the final Battle of Yorktown. So the French Navy arrives to support, Yorktown, is positioned such that there's water on one side and the fort, and then there's land, obviously. So the French Navy comes in, and not only that, U.S. soldiers are now moving in from on land into the city. And in October of 1781, the British surrender to the Continental Army, and America wins the war. Overall, I think it was around 25,000 soldiers died in the Revolutionary War. Colonial soldiers died in the Revolutionary War. Accurate numbers are kind of hard to keep track because we don't really have many records from that time, but they're estimating around 25,000. And this, while it doesn't seem like a lot, would have been the entire population of New York City at the time. So New York City at the time had about 22,000 people. So it was still quite a bit for the colonies. And so the result is we have our freedom. And we're going to go into detail about what different people were doing and reading some more about individual experiences. But that is a general overview and hopefully a little bit more helpful and quicker for those who maybe couldn't do the whole America the Story of Us video.